In the heart of Beverly Hills, nestled behind towering hedges and an ornate iron gate, sits a stately white colonial-style home. It was once the residence of the beloved actress Elizabeth Montgomery, best known for her role as Samantha Stephens in Bewitched. After her passing in 1995, the house remained empty for years, changing hands only once before falling into a state of quiet neglect. That is, until Mark and Julia Henderson, a young couple from New York, purchased it in 2022 with dreams of restoring its former glory. From the moment they moved in, things felt off. Julia, a freelance writer, often worked late into the night. She would hear faint whispers drifting through the hallways, though she could never make out the words. Mark, a real estate investor with a skeptical mind, dismissed it as the house settling. One night, as Julia sat at her desk in the study, she felt an inexplicable chill. The air turned thick with the scent of lavender, a fragrance she didn't use. Moments later, the room's overhead light flickered before going out entirely. When she reached for her phone flashlight, she swore she saw a silhouette in the doorway, delicate, feminine, watching her. By the time Mark arrived, there was nothing there. The couple's unease grew when Julia began seeing shadows move in the large vanity mirror in the master bedroom. It wasn't just tricks of the light. Sometimes, as she brushed her hair, she would catch a glimpse of a woman smiling at her, only for the image to vanish when she turned around. Julia wasn't the only one affected. Mark, who prided himself on logic, woke up one night to the sound of soft laughter. Not Julia's, but something familiar yet distant. He turned on the bedside lamp and saw the rocking chair in the corner, moving on its own. Determined to get answers, the Hendersons began researching the home's history. They learned that Elizabeth Montgomery had adored the house, often calling it her sanctuary. It was where she felt most at peace, away from the scrutiny of Hollywood. It was also rumored that she had an affinity for the mystical. Some even claimed she had dabbled in witchcraft, though that was likely just Bewitched fans romanticizing her legacy. One evening, Julia invited a friend, Rebecca, a self-proclaimed medium, to visit. As they sat in the dimly lit living room, Rebecca closed her eyes and listened. "She's here," she whispered. "She doesn't want to leave." At that moment, the chandelier above them swayed violently, as if protesting the intrusion. A framed photo of Elizabeth, which Julia had found in the attic and placed on a shelf, suddenly fell face down. The message was clear: this was still Elizabeth's home. Faced with undeniable proof of the paranormal, Julia found herself feeling an odd sense of comfort. Unlike the terrifying hauntings in horror movies, this wasn't malevolent, it was almost protective. She began to embrace the idea that they were sharing the space with a legendary spirit. Mark, however, couldn't shake the fear. When a heavy book was thrown from a shelf in front of him, he decided he'd had enough. The couple put the house up for sale in early 2024. Strangely, no one has made an offer. To this day, neighbors report seeing a soft, flickering light in the upstairs windows even when the house is empty. Some claim to hear laughter on the wind, reminiscent of Elizabeth's iconic chuckle from Bewitched. A few brave souls have even tried to spend the night inside, only to leave before sunrise, whispering of a presence that still lingers. Perhaps Elizabeth Montgomery never truly left. Maybe, in some way, she is still watching over the home she loved, forever enchanting those who dare to step inside. The house sat in limbo, its for sale sign slowly gathering dust as potential buyers came and went, none staying longer than an hour. Mark and Julia Henderson had already moved out, yet something kept pulling Julia back. One evening, after a restless night in their temporary apartment, Julia felt an overwhelming urge to return. Mark refused to join her, so she drove alone, her hands gripping the wheel as she approached the grand old house. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt the warmth of something unseen, the air thick with the familiar lavender scent. The house wasn't cold and hostile. It was expectant. Wandering the dimly lit halls, Julia's footsteps echoed against the hardwood. She stopped at a door they had never been able to open, the small attic room at the end of the hallway. The key had long been lost, and despite multiple locksmiths attempting to pry it open, It had remained stubbornly shut. But tonight, as Julia reached out, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts, swirling in the moonlight that seeped through the single round window. Against the far wall stood an antique writing desk, covered in yellowed papers. Julia stepped closer, her breath hitching as she read the first page. Elizabeth's handwriting. The paper was fragile, the ink faded but still legible. It was a letter never sent, never finished. To the one who will understand, it began. Julia's hands trembled as she continued reading. If you have found this, then you must feel it too. The pull, the whispers in the dark, the presence in the mirror that is not quite me, but not something else either. A chill ran down Julia's spine. Not quite me? What did that mean? The last few lines were unfinished, the ink trailing off as if Elizabeth had been interrupted. I thought I could control it, but now I'm not so sure. If I disappear, the pen stroke ended in a long, jagged mark. Elizabeth had never disappeared. She had passed away from cancer in 1995, hadn't she? A creak sounded behind Julia. The door, which had been wide open moments ago, was now almost closed. And then a whisper, right behind her ear. You're getting too close. The air turned ice cold. Something wasn't right. Elizabeth Montgomery's spirit might not be the only one in this house. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Julia spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. The attic room was empty, yet the whisper still lingered in the air, as if the words had embedded themselves into the walls. She clutched the letter tighter, her eyes scanning the desk for more clues. There were other papers, scattered and half-hidden beneath dust and time. Some were scripts with handwritten notes in the margins, likely Elizabeth's own revisions. Others were letters unsent, like the first one. Then Julia saw it. A small, leather-bound journal, tucked beneath a pile of papers. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The first few pages were filled with personal thoughts about Hollywood, about life, about her battle with illness. But the entries soon took a strange turn. I thought it was just a feeling at first. Presence always just out of sight. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Julia's breath caught. The writing became more frantic as the pages went on. It knows me. It watches me in the mirror. It moves things when I'm not looking. Sometimes, I hear it laughing in my own voice. The laughter. Julia had heard it too. She kept reading. I tried to leave once, but I couldn't. Every time I packed a bag, something stopped me. The phone would ring and no one would be there. The doors would lock on their own. Then, one night, I woke up standing in the attic. I don't remember how I got there. Julia swallowed hard. The same attic she was standing in now. She turned the page. The next entry was different. The handwriting was shakier, almost distorted. It's not me anymore. Julia's breath hitched. The final entry was just 2 words. It's free. A soft creak echoed from the far side of the attic. Julia's eyes darted to the antique mirror leaning against the wall. The glass was dusty, cracked along the edges, but something about it felt wrong. She took a step closer. Her own reflection stared back at her. But then it blinked. Not at the same time as she did. A fraction of a second too late. Julia's heartbeat slammed in her chest. Her reflection smiled. But Julia hadn't. Then, in a voice that was almost hers but not quite, it whispered, "Now you understand," and the attic door slammed shut. Julia lunged for the door, her heart pounding so hard it nearly drowned out her own panicked breath. She twisted the knob, yanked at it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the attic thickened, pressing down on her like an unseen weight. Behind her, the mirror stood still, but she knew she felt that whatever was inside it was watching. She refused to turn around. Stay calm. Think. The windows. There was one small, round window in the attic, just big enough to squeeze through if she had to. But as soon as she took a step toward it, the light in the room shifted, as if the moon itself had dimmed. And then a voice. Not the whisper from before. This was different. Closer. Familiar. You don't belong here. Julia's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't coming from behind her. It was coming from inside her own head. Her body felt wrong, like she wasn't alone inside her own skin. A strange tingling sensation crawled up her arms, down her spine, making her hands tremble uncontrollably. And then a touch. Something brushed against her shoulder. She spun around. The mirror. For a moment, everything looked normal. Just her reflection, wide-eyed and terrified. But then her reflection did something she hadn't. It stepped forward. The glass rippled like water as the other Julia pressed her hand against it. Perfect copy. Same face, same clothes, except her expression was different. Calm. Expectant. And then she spoke. "I've been waiting for you." A crack splintered through the glass. The room plunged into darkness. And Julia screamed. Julia's scream barely left her throat before the darkness swallowed everything. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a suffocating, inky void, pressing in on her like a heavy, unseen force. For a split second, she thought she was falling. Then silence. A heartbeat later, the room lurched back into existence. But something had changed. The air smelled different, older like dust and faded perfume. The attic looked the same, but not quite. The cracks in the mirror were gone. The desk, once cluttered with Elizabeth's papers, was now neatly arranged, as if someone had just left it that way. And then Julia noticed something that sent ice through her veins. The door, which had slammed shut moments ago, was now wide open. Julia took a slow step forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. She moved through the attic doorway into the dim hallway, except it wasn't her hallway. The wallpaper was different. The light fixtures were older. The air carried the faint hum of music playing from somewhere downstairs. A soft, jazzy melody, muffled as if coming from an old record player. She turned her head toward the staircase. At the bottom stood a woman. Julia's breath hitched. The woman wasn't looking at her, she was standing in front of a mirror, adjusting an earring. Her blonde hair pinned up in a way that felt familiar. Elizabeth Montgomery. Julia's legs nearly gave out. This wasn't just a ghostly vision. She wasn't seeing the past. She was in it. Julia wanted to call out, to say something, anything, but her throat tightened. Her mind screamed that this wasn't real, that she was hallucinating. And then Elizabeth turned. Their eyes met. And for the briefest moment, Elizabeth's face twisted in an expression Julia didn't expect. Not fear. Recognition. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't be here." A shadow moved behind her. The music stopped. And something else, something much darker, stepped into the room. Julia couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The shadow behind Elizabeth wasn't just a trick of the dim lighting, it was something else entirely. It shifted unnaturally, its edges curling and twisting as if it were alive, but struggling to hold its shape. Elizabeth's expression hardened. "You need to listen to me," she said, her voice low, urgent. But Julia wasn't listening. She was staring at the thing behind Elizabeth. It wasn't just a shadow. It had eyes. Two hollow, dark voids that pulsed like dying embers. And then it moved. The shadowy mass lunged toward Elizabeth. Julia screamed instinctively, without thinking, but as soon as the sound left her lips, the world fractured around her. The music warped into something distorted and wrong. The air asterisk rippled like heat rising from pavement. Then blackness again. For a moment, Julia felt like she was floating. The darkness coiled around her, pressing against her skin, whispering things she couldn't understand. Then suddenly, she was back. The present. The attic. She gasped, stumbling backward, her body drenched in cold sweat. The mirror was shattered, shards scattered across the wooden floor. The attic door was open again, but now the hallway looked normal, her hallway, not Elizabeth's. But something was wrong. Julia's reflection was still in the mirror, even though she had stepped away. And this time it wasn't smiling. It was watching. And then it moved toward her without her moving at all. Julia's lungs seized. She couldn't move, not because something was holding her back, but because every muscle in her body screamed that if she turned her back on the mirror, something worse would happen. Her reflection took another step forward. Julia took a step back, but the reflection didn't. It just stood there, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. A hollow, unnatural stillness settled between them, and Julia knew that what was looking at her wasn't her anymore. Then it tilted its head, just slightly, like it was studying her, and then it raised its hand. Julia's stomach dropped, because she hadn't moved, but the hand in the mirror had, and now it was slowly, deliberately, pressing its palm against the inside of the glass, like it was testing the barrier, like it was looking for a way out. A faint, nearly imperceptible sound tapped against the glass. Not from her side, from inside. Julia staggered back, knocking over a chair in the process. Her heart was a hammer in her chest, her breaths shallow and panicked. Then the reflection smiled. Not a warm smile, not a reassuring one, a knowing smile, like it was waiting. And then, in a voice that sounded too much like her own, the reflection spoke. "It's your turn now." The attic door slammed shut behind her. Julia spun toward the attic door, her pulse thundering in her ears. Locked. Of course it was locked. She turned back to the mirror. The reflection hadn't moved. Still had that eerie, knowing smile. But now something had changed. The attic around it was different, distorted, darker. The shadows stretched unnaturally, as if the space inside the mirror obeyed different rules. And then, the reflection blinked. A slow, deliberate blink. When its eyes reopened, they weren't Julia's anymore. They were Elizabeth's. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind rebelled against the impossibility of what she was seeing, but every instinct in her body told her it was real. The reflection took a step closer to the very edge of the broken glass. And then it spoke again. "She didn't leave." Julia shook her head. No, this isn't real." The reflection's head tilted, amused. "You read the letter. You saw what she wrote." Julia had seen it. The unfinished warning. The final words scratched into the journal. "It's not me anymore." A terrible realization clawed its way into her mind. Elizabeth Montgomery hadn't simply haunted this house. She had been trapped inside it. And now, the reflection Elizabeth placed her palm flat against the glass again. The attic lights flickered violently. The walls groaned like the house itself was breathing. Julia could feel it, the pull. The mirror wasn't just showing her something. It was calling her in. A voice whispered behind her, right against her ear. "It only takes one of us to leave." The air shifted, and the first shard of broken glass began to move. The shard slid across the wooden floor with an unnatural slowness, as if something unseen was pulling it into place. Another piece shifted, then another. Julia's pulse slammed against her ribs. The mirror was fixing itself, and she knew that once it was whole again, something would step out. Or worse, something would pull her in. A soft, rhythmic tapping filled the air. Julia's eyes snapped back to her reflection. Elizabeth, because that's what it was now. Not her, was knocking against the glass from the inside. The way a person might knock on a door before opening it. A slow, deliberate 1, 2, 3. Then the reflection spoke again. "It's almost time." Julia stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. She had to get out, now. But the attic door was still locked. The only way out, her stomach twisted, was the mirror. The glass continued knitting itself back together. Julia could see the fractures closing, the edges smoothing over like water filling an empty space. Her reflection was watching her closely now, as if waiting for her to understand. "You don't have to fight it," Elizabeth's voice coaxed. "I didn't either." Julia's hands curled into fists. No, she wasn't going to let this happen. She wasn't going to let herself be the next name that vanished inside this house. With a burst of adrenaline, she lunged for the nearest heavy object, a rusted metal candle holder left forgotten in the attic's corner. She swung. The mirror shattered apart. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a scream. Not from Julia. From inside the mirror. A sound so raw, so furious, it didn't sound entirely human. The glass shards exploded outward, sending splinters flying as the entire attic seemed to quake in rage. Then, everything stopped. The air went still. The floor beneath Julia's feet steadied. The lights, which had flickered erratically, now burned steady and warm. Julia stood there, chest heaving, staring at the broken pieces at her feet. It was over, or so she thought, because as she turned toward the attic door now inexplicably unlocked, she felt something, cold brush against her wrist. And when she looked down, a single shard of the mirror had remained intact. And in it, Elizabeth was still there, watching, smiling. And this time she wasn't alone. Julia's breath hitched. The last shard of mirror trembled against the wooden floor, reflecting more than just her pale, terrified face. There was something else inside the glass. A figure, shifting just behind Elizabeth's shoulder. Something dark. Something waiting. Elizabeth's lips parted, and though no sound came from the shard, Julia knew what she was saying. It's not over. A sudden rush of air swept through the attic, stirring up dust like a silent exhale from the house itself. Julia took a step back. She needed to leave now. She turned toward the open attic door, her pulse hammering in her ears. Each step away from the mirror felt heavier, like something was pulling at her, reaching for her. The house didn't want her to leave. As she reached the threshold, she hesitated just for a second, and that was her mistake. A sharp, icy pain lanced through her skull. A whisper not outside but inside her own mind. "You didn't break the curse," Julia gasped, gripping the doorframe. Her vision blurred for a moment, like reality itself was struggling to hold its shape. She steadied herself, kept moving. She ran down the attic stairs, through the dimly lit hallway, her own breath ragged in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached the front door. It was unlocked. Part of her almost didn't believe it, but she wasn't going to question it. She shoved the door open and stumbled outside into the cold night air. The house stood silent behind her. No flickering lights, no shifting shadows, just a quiet, perfectly normal house. But she knew better. Her fingers clenched into her palm, and that's when she felt it. A small, sharp object pressing against her skin. Slowly, she opened her hand. A shard of the mirror lay in her palm. She hadn't taken it. It had come with her. Julia's breath trembled. In the moonlight, the tiny piece of glass gleamed, and inside it something moved. Not Elizabeth this time. Not the dark figure. It was her. Her own reflection. But as Julia watched in growing horror, her mirrored self's lips curled into a slow, too familiar smile. A smile she hadn't made. Then a blink. A heartbeat too late. And somewhere, in the silence of the night, Julia swore she heard it. A soft, knowing laugh. The same one she had heard the first night in the house. And deep inside the glass, her reflection watched her back. Waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.